I am about to show you one of the most devastating forces in Latin American history right here. And if you're listening to the podcast, by the way, I'm holding up a banana right now, which means that we are talking about Chapter 2 today in Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. Hello, and welcome back to Champagne Anarchism and our series on this incredible book. If you are just tuning in now, feel free to go back and check out the introduction lecture and the lecture on Chapter 1. You don't need to watch those lectures, but they will give you a little bit of relevant context to tackle this one. You can check all of that out on the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. Everything for this reading series, all this main feed stuff is absolutely free over there. So feel free to dip in and check out some of the other books on that channel as well in your own time. And while we're on it, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube or if you're coming from any of my social media channels, please like, subscribe, follow, all that good stuff. It really helps. And I'm really enjoying kind of the back and forth and some of the comments that I get on those social channels as well. We are building a really awesome community, especially over on TikTok. You can follow me there. You can follow me on Instagram. I have probably 10 followers on Instagram right now. So hello to all of you over there. But if you're just jumping in now, that's absolutely fine, because today we are tackling an enormous topic. We are talking today about the agricultural monarchs. This is a theme with multiple historical threads, and any one of them, if you pull them, you could write multiple books, and people have written multiple books about things like sugar and bananas and rubber, and how these commodities, these agricultural commodities or agricultural monarchs, the way Galeano puts it, colonized the world. Now, in this chapter specifically, Galeano is going through sugar, rubber, cacao, cotton, coffee, and of course, bananas, as well as some thoughts on the slave trade. And we will talk about enslaved people at the end of this lecture as well. Just a couple thoughts for how to contextualize all of this when we talk about agricultural monarchs and slavery. But Galeano tells us about these agricultural monarchs and how they ripped apart the continent in the past and how they continue to do so in the present day. Now, as always, my intention with these videos is to break these down into kind of a manageable structure, just because they can be very sprawling. Remember, this is a book that was written supposedly in 12 weeks, and so you will see that this is at times very scattered. This is a brilliant, genius book, but there's a lot packed in here, and it doesn't necessarily have a very logical flow. So what I'm going to try to do in this video here is give you a little bit of a context. And so the roadmap that I'm going to give here is based on 5 major themes that we can kind of structure this information through. First of all, we're going to be looking at the environmental damage, the ecological cost of these environmental monarchs, and just the havoc that they wreaked in terms of environmentalism. Second, we'll be looking at how the reliance on these agricultural industries traps countries in the world economy. This is kind of a follow-on with the natural resource curse, which we talked about in Chapter 1. And if you want more information, go back to that Chapter 1 video that should be up on the Patreon site and on YouTube as well. Check that out. There's a little bit of an involved discussion that I get into on the natural resource curse, but I do think that that's very important context to have for this sort of thing. The third theme is boom and bust. So when we talk about being locked into the international system with these commodities, these agricultural goods that are being exported, you are constantly in a situation of boom and bust cycles. Then, number 4, we're going to get into a little bit about how the agricultural goods allow for a huge consolidation of power in the hands of just a few people, notably elites, domestic elites in the countries that we're going to be talking about, and of course, foreign corporations. And finally, we will look more broadly at how these agricultural goods form the basis of empire. Well, let's get into it. Let's dig in. This is a huge chapter. I believe it to be one of the biggest in the book, and it is endlessly fascinating. And also within this, there are any number of avenues that we could kind of pursue to talk about this. So if you have thoughts of your own, I want to hear them. But without further ado, let's get into it, starting with the environment. In the context of all of this death and destruction that we've talked about, why are we talking about the environment? You know, of course, the environment is important. Everybody agrees on that. Well, listen, everybody probably watching this video agrees on that anyway. But against the backdrop of genocide, yes, it may seem a little bit secondary. But Galeano is here to tell us that, in fact, these things go together. You know, this chapter is all about the ways that various types of agricultural goods were brought to Latin America to be grown and exported around the rest of the world. So what we're really talking about here when we talk about agricultural monarchs is cash crops and monocultures. A monoculture, you've probably heard this word before, a monoculture is what happens when you grow just one thing in one particular area. Nothing else is, you're not worried about anything else. You're just trying to grow this one specific thing. Now, a monoculture is actually how most factory farming these days goes. And we have various types of processes to make sure that we can continue to grow these crops without completely stripping the soil and leaving us with infertile, barren space. And that's anything from various types of fertilizers to leaving certain areas fallow in certain periods. There's crop rotations that goes on, all of this. But what you have to understand from this is that our entire modern system is actually based on this idea of cash crops and monocultures. And it's because we live under a capitalist system. And so this system, the latifundio system that we'll talk about in a second, that was pioneered in this time of Spanish and Portuguese conquest across Latin America, it's actually very much what we live with today, just in a different form. You're not producing goods necessarily to be eaten. Of course, they will be eaten, but you're not really worried about, you know, which goods are the easiest to produce here, or excuse me, which agricultural products are the best to grow here in these conditions, or which will provide the most nutrients, etc. What you're really worried about is what will sell. And when you're exclusively worried about what will sell, that becomes a problem. So the factory farm in this era of Latin America was the latifundio. Latifundios were and are, because they still exist, there is still a modern incarnation of this thing, they were a system of production that was operated basically with workers who acted as serfs. So this is almost a feudal system, right? You have a huge plot of land. In the middle is the owner of the property, the owner of the latifundio, and across the land are serf-like workers who are producing products that are then channeled towards the central owner. This is kind of a plantation style thing. Now, why does it matter that monocultures abound? Because they're incredibly destructive. You know, the land and soil need variety. They need various nutrient sources. They need constant replenishing, and they need cycles of plant death and decay. A monoculture provides literally none of that. And that's how the production of various agricultural commodities throughout Latin America absolutely destroyed Latin American soil, which previously was incredibly fertile. Galeano writes about northeastern Brazil, where sugar was established, these giant cane plantations. This was brought in by the Dutch, he says. He says, naturally fitted to produce food, it became a place of hunger, where everything had bloomed exuberantly. The destructive and all-dominating latifundio left sterile rock, washed-out soil, eroded lands. Basically, to get to sugar, to get to these vast cane plantations, everything else was devastated. Of course, this led to mass starvation and hunger. And by the way, this is something that we've seen elsewhere as well, right? The worst starvations experienced by humans in history, they tend to be man-made. Things like the Bengal famine of 1943 or the Irish potato famine, that's 1845. These are man-made things. Both of those regions were actually exporting. They were continuing to export food to the metropole. Remember, we talked about the metropole and satellite. These are satellites exporting food to the metropole as the satellite starves. But that's just what happens. When you have a variety of small farms that are just eradicated, they're just wiped away so that you can produce one thing, one crop, one giant commodity that's mostly going to be exported. Again, this is just for profit. It leaves you incredibly vulnerable to changes in environmental conditions. You know, Galeano writes that Brazil by the end of the 16th century had 120 sugar mills, and the owners of those sugar mills were incredibly wealthy people. And they just weren't growing any food. These are regions, these latifundios, are importing all of their food, which is wild. Galeano says abundance and prosperity went hand in hand, as usual, with chronic malnutrition and misery for most of the population. So that's the environment. Let's move quickly into the world economy. This is the second theme here, which is the idea that agricultural exports trap us in the world economy. This is a fascinating idea, and it comes to us again from sugar. So Galeano writes in this chapter that the sugar islands, and he's talking here about places like Barbados, like Puerto Rico, like Haiti, etc., they were to be incorporated into the global world sugar market and condemned to produce sugar until our day. And remember the natural resource curse here. We talked about this in the first lecture. In the old days, when you were producing sugar for colonizers with enslaved labor, it made sense. You were literally being forced to produce it. When you're locked into the global market, however, the effect is actually practically the same. Because of the phenomenon that is the natural resource curse, the rest of your economy has kind of withered away as this one commodity. Everything in your economy is centralized around this one thing. Nothing else really matters, and so it just kind of dies away. And so you're left in a situation where you are just locked into the production of this thing. You literally can't do anything else. This, by the way, is something that the Cuban revolutionaries, people like Fidel Castro, realized when they overthrew Fulgencio Batista, the dictator, in 1959, they kind of discovered this exact same thing. It was a new independent nation, but it wasn't really actually independent because they were locked into the global economic system, this vast trading system that we have built and that they just found themselves all of a sudden, revolutionary otherwise, a part of. Cuba, just to run the country, they still had to continue producing sugar. And Galeano actually supports this, and this is one of the moments in this book where I sort of depart from Galeano, because what Galeano is saying is he believes that sugar's power can be harnessed for the revolution. Now that's a very tempting idea. He says that the revolution, early on, they tried to destroy cane fields and diversify agriculture overnight, but it realized, the revolution did, that it had confused the knife for the assassin. This is really, really brilliant language. It's a perfect metaphor. Sugar was the knife, but imperialism was the assassin. And so they were trying to get rid of sugar when, in fact, they should have just been focused on the imperialism and used sugar as a tool for the revolution itself. Now that sounds great and potentially, of course, could work, but I would point out that Cuba's economy actually still relies a lot on sugar, and this is even after the US trade embargo. It never really escaped sugar at all. Using sugar as a tool, it didn't actually work at all because you still have the natural resource curse. And of course, you're still locked into the rules of global trade. Now, Cuba's revolutionary government, of course, it spent the sugar money way better than the Batista regime would have previously, or had been doing, of course. But there's no question at all that they're still locked into a dependent relationship with sugar just because of the nature of the international market. And that brings us to the third theme here, which is boom and bust, because yes, the natural resource curse is one side of this, but the other side of this is the fact that if you have this fabulous single commodity that is bringing in a ton of money, that might not always be the case. Now, when we get into the following chapter, chapter 3, he's going to talk about nitrates and the fate of countries like Chile that relied on nitrate exports. But we'll get to that and some of the mineral stuff later. For now, let's focus on these agricultural commodities. Because what you have with agricultural commodities is a natural boom and bust cycle. And by the way, this is a bit of a departure. If I can nerd out about economics for just a moment, there's a very famous guy, Raul Prebisch, who is one of the originators of what we talked about in earlier lectures, dependency theory. And Prebisch thought that one of the reasons that dependency was so dangerous was because these commodity exports experienced what he called declining terms of trade. That means that price of manufactured goods will be stable or continue to climb. So if you're producing manufactured goods, your economy will do reasonably well. Meanwhile, the trend of agricultural and commodity, anything that you could just extract and take out of the ground and sell, will fall over time. And there are many reasons why that may be true. And it certainly was a trend when Prebisch was writing this in the 60s, 50s and 60s, I should say. However, that tends to not really be an actual relationship. So Galeano is actually seeing this boom and bust cycle happen, and he's kind of adapting dependency theory to this idea. So Prebisch's ideas kind of fell out of favor because the declining terms of trade is not a secular trend. That is not a clear trend that we can always point to. However, what is absolutely true is that your commodities will not always be worth what you think they will always be worth. The most notable example of this, which Galeano gives in this chapter, is the 1921 Cuban sugar crash, or just the 1921 sugar crash, which absolutely bankrupted the Cuban economy. So the upshot of all of this is once you are locked into this dependent relationship with the international markets, all it takes is just a small change, and it could literally be anything, to precipitate a drop in the price of the one good thing that you are producing, and that's it for your economy. I mean, that's it. Now let's deal with the fourth theme here. We've been talking a lot about the literal mechanics and economics of this system, but what we need to really be talking about is the consolidation of power. And this is before we get into the real empire stuff, because, of course, this is a way or a mechanism to provide the basis for an empire, but it's also a concentration of power in the hands of very few. And there are basically two sides to this. The first side is, of course, the local domestic elite. And Galeano says that in Latin America, the elite was imported, whereas it was homegrown in sort of Northern America. We'll get into that distinction in just a little bit. But the nature of agricultural goods in this sense allowed for this consolidation of power in the hands of just a few people. Remember the latifundio system. Just a few people who owned the latifundio, and all of those agricultural goods flowed up to them. Now, as I say, all of this ties into Galeano's thoughts about the differences between Latin American development and the Northern American development. Galeano has this argument that the US pushed for internal colonization. It developed much more of an egalitarian and organic form of development, at least egalitarian if you're white and own land, but overall, yes. Latin America, by contrast, was based on undermining free farmers. So Galeano has this really cool turn of phrase here where he says that free workers form the basis of the North American settlement. This is a settler colonist economy. While subjugated workers form the basis of Latin American settlement. Either way, all of this finds its kind of most perfect expression in the latifundio system, which Galeano blames for a lot of stuff. He says that the latifundio multiplies mouths but not bread, which I absolutely love. Because of the latifundio system, Latin America imports a lot of food that it could grow itself. This, by the way, is still true of Latin America. And he says as well, the latifundio system, it doesn't actually provide employment. And he pulls some statistics to show that overall employment rates fall when you introduce a latifundio to a location. And major programs across the continent that were supposed to reform land distribution, they often ended up just concentrating more power in the hands of big landlords, which is really, really interesting because you will hear this as a trend. And if you read anything about Latin American history, a lot of it, and I mean a lot of it, comes down to redistribution of land, to land redistribution programs. But what Galeano is here to tell you is that a lot of those land redistribution programs that happened, notably in the 50s and 60s, and Galeano is writing this at the tail end of the 60s, early 70s, they just focused land right back into the hands of the very people that they're supposed to be redistributing that land away from. Now, of course, that's a big claim. A lot of these redistribution programs actually did work fairly well, at least, to get new people into land that they had been previously dispossessed of. However, he's got a fair argument here. But the thing is, it's not just the owners of the latifundios themselves who are being empowered. It's also foreign corporations at the same time. So what agriculture brings, these cash crops brings, is a significant number of foreign companies that are interested in exploitation. Now, this phenomenon, by the way, is very modern. It, of course, existed since the invention of the Dutch and British East India companies. Of course, you have foreign corporations going in and breaking open markets and all of this stuff. This is a natural tendency. However, now what we have is foreign corporations coming in and exploiting almost with complete impunity. And Galeano has examples. I mean, boy, does he have examples. He talks about companies like United Fruit, for example, building their own rail systems, fielding their own police forces. And all of this brings us to the final theme here, which is agricultural monarchs as the basis of empire. All right, we have talked about this before. This nexus between the state and corporate power. This is very, 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 very important. And what Galeano is doing here is quite interesting, actually. He's tying a thread, or he's drawing a line between the old empires, like the one Spain was using, backing their enterprising conquistadors in the way that the empires of today back their corporate conquistadors. And Galeano, throughout this chapter, is kind of giving us a running list. And this is, again, I'm saying this is, it can be a little scattered. So drawing all of these together across the chapter is kind of important, I think. You know, he talks about the Bay of Pigs landings, for example, which tried to overthrow Fidel Castro and included some former capitalists in the ranks. And then also on Bay of Pigs, the Guatemalan dictator, that's Manuel Dígoras Fuentes, provided training grounds for the Bay of Pigs invaders for those troops in return for Guatemalan sugar quotas. He also talks about the way that the Brazilian dictator, that's Garastácio Medici, opened up the interior of Brazil, often with forced labor from the Northeast. By the way, the Northeast never really escapes this plunder, but all of this at the behest of U.S. Steel, which wanted iron and manganese deposits. And we will talk much more about iron and manganese in the third chapter of this book. But Galeano goes on to talk about the corporate conquest of places like Colombia and Venezuela in this unstoppable drive for both coffee and cacao. And of course, cacao in Venezuela is going to turn into oil, which is also going to bring in foreign companies, and the US state, the agent of American imperialism, will be acting in their interests at every point as well. And then, of course, he also talks about bananas. Now, bananas have absolutely destroyed several Central American countries. A lot of this, by the way, comes about because of one man, that's Sam Zamorai. He's known as the Banana King. He founded a company called Cuyamel Fruit, and he later took over United Fruit himself, this kind of like hostile boardroom takeover. It's actually a crazy story. But the upshot of United Fruit and Samurai and all of this is that the US is waging several not just one, but several banana wars across the 1910s and 1920s, especially, where it's opening up markets in places like Honduras, in places like Colombia, in places like Guatemala, in Nicaragua, etc. All of these countries are involved in the so-called banana wars. And again, just a reminder, and we will talk more about this as the book goes on, but there is this powerful connection between state power, especially American power in the modern case anyway, state power, and capitalists. Now, before we close out, we should say something about the slave trade. He makes a big deal of the slave trade in this chapter, and rightly so. And it's worth reading every bit of that section because it is tremendously important to put all of this in context. Now, this may seem fairly obvious, but none of this happens without the mass enslavement of humans from the very earliest days of empire. And at every single step of the way, it enriched everyone involved. You know, Galeano gives an example of the Royal Africa Company at one point paying out 300% dividends. This is crazy, the amount of money that is flowing through the slave trade and everything associated with the slave trade. And also, when slavery ended, it never really ended. You know, of course, we have the latifundio system, which Galeano is criticizing. But Galeano also talks about northeastern Brazil, where debts tied to the plantation, which were by their nature unpayable, were used to keep people in their place. This is during the rubber boom. And we see something similar as well, a little more modern day, with scrip currency being used in American mines, this sort of thing. This idea of using debt to functionally enslave people, it kind of happens a lot. And even modern day, right? Even right now, if you have to work backbreaking conditions, these unbelievably difficult jobs on the coffee plantations of Colombia just to make ends meet, literally just to survive. Is it really voluntary labor at all? And on this very bleak note, we will close out this chapter. Now, how should we understand this chapter? Well, when we cast our eyes across the agricultural monarchs, especially in Latin America, everything from sugar to bananas, they've been a powerful force in undermining the developing world and simultaneously propping up empires. In the name of things like coffee and cacao, empires have justified these really horrible crimes against workers and indigenous people. They have clear-cut, incredibly fertile regions of the world just to produce one thing, and that is for cash. And then that one thing is to be exported. So let me know what you think about this. Has this made you rethink in any way the ways that agricultural goods work, the things we buy in a store on a day-to-day basis? One thing I find myself thinking about kind of a lot, actually, is this right here, the mighty banana. Do I need this banana? Or at least, do I need this banana so cheaply? What is the true cost of something like this? Either way, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the Patreon feed. Again, that's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Let me know your thoughts on social media and tune in next week for chapter 3. That is, of course, the invisible sources of power. We are getting a lot more into mining and minerals in this next, and metals, of course. A lot of stuff in the next chapter is going to be coming up. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I will see you next time.